Hello and welcome to my channel. If this is the first video of mine that you are watching, my name is Anna Marie, and today I'm going to be talking about 24 books that I would like to read before the end of 2024. We have just passed into the second half of the year, so I feel like now is a really good time to sit down and take a look at all of the books I have acquired over the last little bit and prioritize some of the ones I would like to read before the end of this year. Back in January, I set myself a goal to read 60 books this year, and I just passed that threshold. So everything else that I choose to read throughout the rest of the year is just icing on the cake. So I'm hoping that that will alleviate some of the pressure of trying to read a certain number of books and allow me to prioritize some of my chunkier books that I've had sitting on my shelves that have just been intimidating me for the last several months or so. So I've tried to categorize the 24 books I have in front of me here into some semblance of an order, but there's a whole lot of fantasy, there is some historical fiction, there are some romance books. So without further ado, I'm just going to dive into it. I'm going to start with the chunky books that I have here next to me because these are the ones that I have found so intimidating and I've put off reading just because they are so big and intimidating. And the first one here is not one book, but it is 6 because this is the first omnibus of Gotrek and Felix. And I wanted to just get into this and even just read one of the books, which would make it so much less intimidating, but I've put it off. So the first book is only 230 pages. So that's much less intimidating than the rest of this here. But this is part of the Warhammer world, and this is kind of the fantasy realm. So I have read the Warhammer 40K books, but this is the Warhammer Chronicles, which I've not read any in this universe. I think I might have a Warhammer 40K title amongst all of these books next to me. But yes, Gotrek and Felix. This book is touted, or these characters are touted as a great entry point into Warhammer if you are a fan of fantasy, because it's a great way to get into this bigger world in a way that still feels pretty familiar. So I've had this on my shelves for probably close to 2 years now and haven't read it. So I'm really hoping before the end of 2024 that I will have a chance and sit down and read this book here. The next big chunky book that I've had sitting on my shelves for far too long is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. And I'm pretty sure I have read something by Susanna Clarke before, but this is a big book with, it's 850 pages, I think, but it's historical fiction set in the early 1800s. And I feel as if there's a little bit of magical realism throughout this book too, which I absolutely adore magical realism in my historical fiction. And this book does have some really pretty illustrations throughout as well, but the font is quite small. So I have put off reading this big chunky book for far too long, and I'm really hoping that I will sit down and read this maybe on a few summer beach days. That might make it a little bit more manageable. Another historical fiction title is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. I first had this book recommended to me when I was in university, and that was not yesterday. So we're going back maybe 8 years, I think. And this is, like I said, historical fiction. I believe it also takes place in, no, we are starting here in the 1500s, but I have heard such praise about Mantel's writing. Obviously it won the Booker Prize, so she is a very talented author. But I've heard such praise for how she writes historical fiction and how it really feels historically accurate. It was a history professor actually who first recommended this series to me. So I'm really hoping that I'll have a chance to sit down with this one as well. Obviously there is a reason that I have picked up all of these books over the last little while, so I'm going to be excited to read all of them. So I'm going to try to stop saying that for each specific book. But this one also comes highly recommended, and this time from a really good friend, Sarah, who actually bought me this copy of The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. And this is a big book like the previous ones. And I have read the Bone Season series by Samantha Shannon. At the very least, I've read the first 3 books, and I've enjoyed her writing. The Bone Season is YA fantasy, whereas this is adult, and I believe we have a sapphic romance at the heart of this book, and I'm pretty sure we have dragons, which are 2 things that I absolutely love. And yes, this has been all over Book Talk, all over Bookstagram, all over BookTube for a very long while. So I'm late to the club, but hopefully I will enjoy this as much as other people have too. So I feel like those were my chunkiest books. So I'm going to dive into another category, which is one that I set for myself at the beginning of this year, and I want 2024 to be the year of Kay for me. And by Kay, I mean Gavriel Kay. He is a Canadian author, and he is fantastic at character building and character development. I adore Kay's writing for how he creates these convoluted characters that just rip your heart out, and you are rooting for them to succeed even when all of the odds are stacked against them. And even though his books, I find, are more slower paced, more character focused, his world building is also fantastic, and he pulls from history in creating his worlds too. So even though these are fantasy worlds or alternative history worlds with little bits of magic woven throughout, they feel so realistic, so rich. The book I'm holding here is the second book in the Sarantine Mosaic. I have read the first book a couple of months ago now, so this is my next Kay book that I would like to pick up. But I also had on my shelf A Brightness Long Ago and Children of Earth and Sky. These are the only 3 unread Kay books that I currently own, but I am hoping to read his books in order of publication. So this is next in order of publication for me, and then I will be going to my library to, I think the next book by him that I have to read would be Isabel, because I have already read The Lions of Aldersan, as well as A Song of Arbonne, which I absolutely loved. But so here are 3 more books on my list of 24 books that I would like to read before the end of the year, but I'm also hoping to read everything else in Kay's bibliography before the end of the year, which perhaps is a little bit of a lofty goal as we enter into the second half, so we'll see how far into his bibliography I get before December 31st. I have another sequel here, and this is The Thousand Eyes by A.K. Larkwood, which is the sequel to The Unspoken Name, which I think I read 2 years ago now. And this is a young adult fantasy from what I recall, but I also remember there being some sci-fi elements being incorporated into the last book. What I really loved about the first book in this series is that one of the main characters is an orc. And I personally love reading about orcs. I have my own little work in progress that features an orc main character. I think they are stereotypically perceived as the bad guys in fantasy, that I'm kind of loving their redemption arc of the last little while. But yes, this is the second book in a series, like I have said. It does have a sapphic romance at its core, which I really enjoyed, and I'm hoping that this book will delve a little bit more into the relationship and how it progresses. The next book that I'd like to read before the end of the year is The Wolf's Call by Anthony Ryan, and this is the first book in a series. And from my understanding, this is a dark fantasy, and it feels like it's going to be pretty gritty, a dark fantasy, lots of war and strife throughout. There's comparisons on the back here to Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time and George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire. So I'm looking forward to this one. I've not read anything by Anthony Ryan, but I've heard really good things. I believe he's the author of The Pariah, which I've seen a lot of hype about online. So we'll see how I get on with The Wolf's Call, and fingers crossed. Next, I have Dead Man's Hand by James J. Butcher. And James J. Butcher is the son of Jim Butcher, who writes the Dresden Files, which is one of my favorite series. And similar to the Dresden Files, this book here, Dead Man's Hand, is also an urban fantasy series, and it follows an inexperienced witch on the run who will need to throw out the magic rulebook to solve the murder of his former mentor. So it kind of sounds like a really good fast-paced fantasy read, and the font is pretty big here. It seems like it won't take me very long to read at all. So I have high hopes for this one if James J. Butcher's writing is anything like his father's, and I imagine that it will feel a little bit reminiscent of Jim Butcher's writing. Next is another dark, gritty fantasy, and that is Glen Cook's The Black Company, and I have this Tor Essentials edition here. This is heralded on the front as the pioneering novel of modern military fantasy, and I have heard great things about it for just what it did in the genre for military fantasy and epic fantasy. So in this one, we have the really classic 1980s fantasy battle of good versus evil, and I am looking forward to it. And again, it's not a very long book, 250 pages with standard sized font, so I definitely need to pick this one up sooner rather than later. And I was correct in saying that I had a Warhammer 40k within this stack of books, and that is Ravenor Returned by Dan Abnett. This is the second book in the Ravenor trilogy, and I have read the Eisenhorn trilogy, and they kind of all form a bigger story with shared characters between the series. I adored the Eisenhorn trilogy for Abnett's character development of Eisenhorn. I really enjoyed the first one of Ravenor as well, so I'm looking forward to the second one. I already have the third on my shelf too, but I'm prioritizing the second book before the end of 2024, and I'll likely end up finishing the trilogy as well, hopefully. Next is another military fantasy story, and that is The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang. This was initially self-published back in 2018, I believe, but then it was picked up and traditionally published this year. And a couple of months before it was published, traditionally, I received a recommendation from one of my friends that they absolutely adored this story. I believe one of the main characters is a mother, so a large component of the story is about a mother's love and what they are willing to do for their children. Yes, our main character was determined to be a good housewife and mother, so she hid away her sword, but fate comes a-knocking and she must pick up the sword once more. So looking forward to this one. I've heard really good things, and it's a little bit chunky. There's 600 pages, even though it doesn't quite look like that here, but we will see what I think of this book here. Another classic fantasy story is Dragons of Winter Night, which is the second book in the Dragonlance Chronicles by Margaret, Weis, and Tracy Hickman. I've written an article all about the Dragonlance books, and it finally encouraged me to pick up the books. I have played a little bit of D&D, and it's just the classic fantasy adventure trope with a ragtag band of adventurers who are thrown all together, which is one of my favorite tropes. And I will say, having played a little bit of D&D, reading the first book in this series, it was so much fun to be able to identify certain parts of the game within the book. So I kind of fell in love with the characters, and I'm looking forward to see how their adventure continues in Dragons of the Winter Night. Okay, I'll try to go through the rest of the fantasy books that I have here. The first one is 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City by KJ Parker. And while this is still fantasy, this I don't imagine is going to be quite as dark and gritty as some of the other fantasy books that I have mentioned. I have read a few novellas by KJ Parker, and I really like the black humor, the gallows humor, tongue-in-cheek way that they write. So I found this in a secondhand shop last summer, I think, and I picked it up. So I'm really excited to see if the tone and the way that Parker writes in his novellas translates into a full-length novel too. And again, it looks like it will be a really quick read for me. I have the first book, I don't have the second book, and then I have the third book in the series. So if I really enjoy this one, I will definitely be picking up the sequel so that then I can continue on with the series. If the lighting and my camera angle changed slightly there, I apologize. My camera battery died on me. But the book that I was talking about before I was so rudely interrupted is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir. And unlike most of the books that I have on my list of 24 books I'd like to read before the end of 2024, this is a YA fantasy, and it is still slightly dark and gritty because it is following a necromancer, but this was also a gift from my lovely friend Sarah, and she sang its praises, and I also just think the description sounds amazing. It unveils a solar system of swordplay, cutthroat politics, and lesbian necromancers. So this is also the first book in a series, so if I like this one, I do have more where it came from, and I do have high hopes for this book here. The next book that I would like to read before the end of the year is looking much more beat up because this is a second-hand copy I picked up of Furies of Calderon, which is the first book in the Codex Alera series by Jim Butcher. I've already sang my praises about Jim Butcher. I love his writing. I love the way that he is able to infuse humor throughout his books. I find his characters really entertaining and funny. This book started on a little bit of a bet from, I believe it started online or with one of his previous writing instructors. I forget the details, but it was all about making an entertaining book from a non-entertaining idea. And I'm pretty sure the premise began with Pokemon and the Roman Empire. So we have our main character who has no powers in a world with powers everywhere, and he's our main protagonist. I love a good underdog story, so I have high hopes for this book here, and I hope that I love it as much as I adore the Dresden Files. Shifting gears slightly from fantasy to magical realism, the next book on my list is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. I feel as if I am one of the very few people left who haven't read this book, but I've had it on my radar for a little bit, haven't felt really incentivized to pick it up, but then I saw it at a book sale the other week and couldn't resist for just a couple of bucks picking up a copy. And on the back here, it just says that between life and death, there is a library, and within that library, the shelves go on forever. Every book provides a chance to try another life you could have lived, to see how things would be if you had made other choices. Would you have done anything different if you had the chance to undo your regrets? I very recently read When All Is Said by Anne Griffin, I believe, and the premise of that book is reflecting back on this man's life. He is in his 80s and he walks into a bar and he orders a drink for one drink for 5 people representative of his life, and just looks back at the whole course of his life and what has led him to this moment. So it was a very reflective book on your life, your legacy, your regrets, and your cherished memories. So I think I am a little bit in that melancholic, reflective mood. So I think I might pick up this book sooner rather than later too, just to continue on with that theme. The premise of this book, The Midnight Library, also reminds me a little bit of Hell's Library by A.J. Hackwith, which is a series I read last year and absolutely adored. Another magical realism book that I'd like to read before the end of the year is The Valkyrie by Kate Heartfield. And according to The Guardian, Heartfield sustains a fine balance between history and fantasy. I feel as if most of the fantasy or magical realism books that I read, if they're not taking place in a contemporary setting, they're often set in a British, Scottish, or Irish inspired setting. So I have been trying to make an effort in the last couple of months to branch out from that. And strangely enough, Norse is where I keep on going. I recently read A Fate Inked in Blood by Danielle L. Jensen, which is inspired by Norse and Viking mythology. And the Valkyrie here is also inspired by Norse mythology and follows a shield maiden. So I am very much looking forward to this. And this book here was a gift for my birthday back at the end of last year. And it is signed by the author who wrote for the Ottawa Citizen for a very long time, and I believe she wrote out of City Hall for a period of time. But yes, I lived in Ottawa, so I'm so excited to see her career take off. We're down to the last 5 books on my list of 24 books to read before the end of the year. And the next one is Witch King by Martha Wells. I have read the Murderbot Diaries by Martha Wells and absolutely adore that series. I love the character Murderbot. I find him so entertaining and strangely so relatable. But I'm looking forward to Wells's entry into the adult fantasy world with this book. And apparently this is a story of power and friendship, trust and betrayal, and of the families we choose. I love found family, and that is a really prevalent trope and theme in the Murderbot Diaries. So it's very exciting that that is also going to be a theme here in Witch King. And I think there might be something to do with demons or the afterlife in this book. Yes, it says here, I didn't know you were a demon, you idiot. I'm the demon. So really looking forward to this one here. This is the latest book to make its way onto my shelf, and that is Can't Spell Treason Without Tea by Rebecca Thorne, which is a cozy fantasy steeped with love. And I have just been in the mood for cozy fantasy lately, but I feel as if a lot of the times cozy fantasy for me misses the mark because I still want to have really intricate world building and feel immersed in the world. I want great character building and great character development as well. I just don't want there to be a lot of murder. So I'm hoping that Thorne is able to kind of hit the mark for me with just a nice little tea shop cozy fantasy book about love and tea and happiness and all that good stuff. Next, I actually have 2 books by Juliette Marillier on the list of books I'd like to read before the end of the year. The first one is the first book in the Blackthorn and Grimm series, and that is Dreamer's Pool. I believe I've heard Jean from Jean's Bookish Thoughts here on YouTube sing this book's praises. I'm pretty sure I've picked up Marillier's titles because of her recommendations. This is a fantasy romance novel. We have a little bit of enemies to lovers on a quest, so it sounds right up my alley, and I'm really looking forward to this book. The next Marillier title I have is A Dance with Fate, which is the first book in the Warrior Bards series. And this follows a young woman who is a bard and a warrior who is seeking to repay her debts and settle scores in this thrilling historical fantasy series. I'm not sure how prevalent romance is in this book. I have actually read the first book in the Seven Waters series as well, but haven't continued on with that series, but I now own each book in the Warrior Bards trilogy. So I'd really like to at least read the first book before the end of the year. And finally, the last book that I'd like to read before the end of the year is one that I will for sure be picking up sooner rather than later, because it is an arc, and it is an arc that I was so excited to receive, and that is The Pairing by Casey McQuiston. I was so excited to get this in my mailbox because I adore red, white, and royal blue. Alex and Henry are just one of my favorite book couples. So this one, it follows Theo and Kit, who are exes that embark on a European wine tour, and in an effort to prove that they absolutely are not still into each other, they make a bet to see who can hook up with the most amount of people. And it just sounds like a rip-roaring good time, and I'm so looking forward to this book. That this will probably be one of the books that I read on the beach this summer before it comes out in the beginning of August. But those are the 24 books that I would like to read before the end of the year. If you have read any of the books I've mentioned or are planning to read any of the books that I've mentioned, please let me know down in the comments below, because I would love to chat about them with you. But other than that, thank you very much for watching this video, and hopefully I will be back very soon with a new one. Bye for now.